This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I apologize that I have to speak in English. I don't have German, I'm afraid, but I know that you're all bilingual and can cope with my English. The later Wittgenstein, I claim, was not a transcendental idealist. So there you go, you've got the answer to the question straight away. But I shall say a little bit more. Well, this is a bold, cryptic claim which, among other things, cries out for a definition of transcendental idealism. And I shall supply a definition in due course. But it does also stand in need of an immediate qualification. In claiming that the later Wittgenstein was not a transcendental idealist, I'm not suggesting that he confronted transcendental idealism and argued against it. Still less that he adopted some other ism instead of it. That would have been completely antithetical to Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy. On Wittgenstein's conception, philosophy is a kind of therapy, and its purpose is to cure us whenever, through the misuse of our own language, we become troubled by unanswerable questions or pseudo-questions posing as deep problems. So it's not the point of philosophy to advance isms. I mean, if in the course of doing philosophy you affirm anything at all, then it will be by way of showing how certain words are used. And what one affirms will, as likely as not, be a platitude or an item of common empirical knowledge, not something that needs to be debated. So, depending on how exactly transcendental idealism is defined, it's either of no concern to philosophy at all, or, more probably, a bit of nonsense that has to be flushed out of the system by means of some suitable philosophical purgative. Very well then, how do I define transcendental idealism? Well, of course, the term is Kant's, and I want to use it in a broadly Kantian way. But broadly Kantian is the operative phrase. Kant himself, of course, had in mind a doctrine specifically about the nature of space and time. If you were to define transcendental idealism as Kant understood it, you would need to make reference to space and time. There is, however, a trend in philosophy nowadays, which I aim to follow, to use the term in an extended sense that is supposed to arise naturally out of Kant's. So that's what I'll be doing. I'll be appropriating this term and using it in a way that's roughly Kantian, but it's certainly not going to be Kant's own usage. Now, Kant himself used the term to stand for one of two species of idealism, the other being empirical idealism. Got this contrast in Kant between transcendental idealism and empirical idealism, and I shall follow Kant in that respect as well. But as in the case of transcendental idealism, I shall use the term empirical idealism, and for that matter idealism on its own, without any qualification, in a way that's broadly Kantian rather than Kant's very own usage. So, to the definitions, and for ease of reference, I've included these on the handout. I hope people have access to a copy of the handout. Idealism, as I understand it, is the view that the limits of that to which our representations answer are set in part by some feature of the representations themselves. The limits of that to which our representations answer are set in part by some feature of the representations themselves. Now, by a representation here, I mean anything that answers to reality and is thereby true or false. So our representations include our thoughts, our judgments, our theories, and such like. And by the limits of something, I mean its essential features. So idealism, on this conception, is the view that the essential features of that to which our thoughts and judgments and theories answer are set in part by some feature of the thoughts, judgments and theories themselves. Empirical idealism includes the rider that the setting of these limits lies within them. It is itself an aspect of that to which our representations answer. Transcendental idealism includes the rider that the setting of these limits lies beyond them. It's not itself a feature of that to which our representations answer. And the limits are, relative to it, limitations. That's to say, they exclude certain possibilities, albeit possibilities that lie beyond what we can think, or what we can judge, or what we can theorize about. So that's how I'm going to be using these three terms: idealism, empirical idealism, and transcendental idealism. I should perhaps add that I'm not much concerned about whether this usage coincides with anyone else's, although just as my ultimate inspiration is Kant, my more immediate inspiration is Bernard Williams, who himself applies these notions to the discussion of Wittgenstein, albeit in his case in the course of a discussion in which he arrives at the opposite conclusion to mine. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Bernard Williams's work in this area. Some of you perhaps don't know it, but Williams urges that there is a sense in which the later Wittgenstein was a transcendental idealist. And I've already said that my view is that Wittgenstein was not a transcendental idealist. But, as I hope will emerge, there is less of a difference between Williams and me than there may appear to be. And certainly Williams has been one of the principal points of reference throughout what follows. Now, I said earlier that on Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy, transcendental idealism is either of no concern to philosophy, or it's a bit of nonsense that has to be flushed out of the system. And I don't want to retract that. The later Wittgenstein, to repeat, was not a transcendental idealist, in my view. Nevertheless, the main point of this lecture is to show that Wittgenstein's relevance to transcendental idealism or perhaps we should say its relevance to him, lies not in his giving us license to ignore it, nor in his supplying the methods for finally disposing of it, but on the contrary, in his providing us with an inducement, in spite of himself, to embrace it. So the idea is going to be that there are forces in Wittgenstein that do lead in the direction of transcendental idealism. And this is part of the reason for what I said a little while ago, that there's less of a difference between Bernard Williams and me than there may appear to be. Transcendental idealism, despite the fact that its outright endorsement would be so utterly un-Wittgensteinian, has an important place in Wittgenstein's work. Or perhaps a better way to put it would be, it has an important place in Wittgensteinian exegesis. For Wittgenstein, philosophy involves self-conscious attention to the use of language. This means commanding a clear view of how words are used, reflecting on what does and does not make sense, feeling one's way around inside one's outlook or one's various outlooks. And I should say that here and elsewhere in this lecture, I shall use the term outlook to denote a way of seeing the world. To have a particular outlook is to treat some things as relevant to others, to be disposed to make various connections between things, to be struck by certain similarities and differences, to find some things natural foci of attention, and such like. Now, self-conscious attention to the use of language also means, or includes, recognizing certain propositions as necessary. So, a very simple example is the proposition that aunts are female. Such propositions do not embody substantial claims about the world. They register the interrelations of concepts. For Wittgenstein, saying aunts are female is enunciating a rule rather than making an assertion, and saying aunts have to be female is alluding to that fact. We will not count somebody as an aunt unless we also count that person as female. But notice how necessity is thereby grounded in contingency. Wittgenstein is keen to dispel the view that in exploring meaning in the way described, we're exploring some unchanging superphysical landscape, as though the concept of an aunt and the concept of femaleness were things that we just stumbled across, one of them an inseparable part of the other. No, that's not Wittgenstein's view. It's on our own contingent practices that we are focusing. And moreover, part of Wittgenstein's genius is his special gift for drawing attention to how deep these contingencies lie. Of course, it's contingent that we use particular words, that's to say particular sounds and particular inscriptions, in the way in which we do. Of course, that's contingent. We might have used the word aunt, A-U-N-T, to denote uncles. But when we reflect self-consciously on our actual classifications, we're inclined to see these as subject to certain constraints. So imagine people who, in some circumstances, use a word to denote green things, and who, in other circumstances, use that very same word to denote blue things. We're inclined to say that they cannot have one concept in mind. They don't count as carrying on in the same way. But Wittgenstein, applying some of his own philosophical methods to this very inclination of ours, urges us to think again about what is involved in carrying on in the same way. It's not that he has in mind one particular favoured view of this that he wants to argue for. Rather, by means of a careful interlacing of hints, suggestions, and descriptions of different cases, he gets us to explore in greater depth the view that we already have. And we come to see what a huge amount we take for granted whenever we count someone or refuse to count someone as carrying on in the same way. Had various facts of nature been different from how they are, and in particular, had various facts of human nature been different from how they are, then all sorts of behaviour might have counted as carrying on in the same way. So, for example, imagine the blue-green case supplemented as follows. Suppose that there are periodic atmospheric conditions that temporarily turn green things blue and blue things green. And the contingencies of language use include all such facts. In particular, and crucially, they include our shared sensibilities, our shared senses of what is natural and what is salient, our shared outlooks, to use the term that I introduced earlier. Without these, communication would break down. As Stanley Cavell marvellously and famously puts it, and this is the quotation on the handout, the first quotation on the handout, that on the whole we make and understand the same projections of words into further contexts is a matter of our sharing roots of interest and feeling, modes of response, senses of humour and of significance and of fulfilment, of what is outrageous, of what is similar to what else, what a rebuke, what forgiveness, of when an utterance is an assertion, when an appeal, when an explanation. All the whirl of organism Wittgenstein calls forms of life. So that's a wonderful quotation from Stanley Cavell, which I think captures the idea very well. Now, Wittgenstein describes forms of life. Cavell finishes by alluding to this famous phrase. Wittgenstein describes forms of life as the given. They are what has to be accepted. And part of what he means is that it is in our biological nature to have certain outlooks. And this comes out in the fact that ultimately we just do respond to our environments in certain ways. Ways that help to sustain communication among us. But the phrase form of life indicates even more than that. We have also been inculcated into various social practices. And as a result, we value certain things, we take certain things for granted, we defer to certain authorities, we accept certain canons of rationality, and we adopt certain modes of interpretation. All of these things help to mould our natural outlooks into the full, sophisticated outlooks in accord with which we produce our linguistic representations. Now, Wittgenstein is adamant that the exploration of language that characterizes philosophy cannot be a scientific exploration. And there are many things that he means by this. For instance, he means that philosophy must be shorn of any pretensions to theory and systematicity. He means that philosophy must be descriptive rather than explanatory. But something else that he means, or at least something else that's very closely related to this, and that he certainly thinks, is that philosophy can never be completely detached. We might have thought that the kind of description of our own linguistic practices required in philosophy would be something whose content could in principle be grasped by someone who did not already understand the language. Nothing less, we might have thought, could have any purchase on someone who misunderstood the language. But for Wittgenstein, such detachment is neither necessary nor possible. Bernard Williams, in the article to which I've already referred, puts very well the kind of thing that Wittgenstein envisages instead. And this is the second quotation on the handout. On a Wittgensteinian conception, we can make our language clearer to ourselves by reflecting on it, as it were, self-consciously exercising it, not indeed by considering alternatives, but by moving around reflectively inside our view of things and sensing when one begins to be near the edge, by the increasing incomprehensibility of things regarded from whatever way out point of view one has moved into. What one becomes conscious of in so reflecting is something like how we go on. And how we go on is a matter of how we think and speak and intentionally and socially conduct ourselves. Another marvellous quotation from Williams. Well, how in that case are we supposed to engage with those who do misunderstand the language? And of course we have to remember that these people are very probably ourselves in another guise. What you're doing in philosophy is correcting your own misunderstandings. How do we engage with those who misunderstand the language? Well, through what we say in the course of these reflections, we give them the same kind of exposure to the language as we give children. We don't so much tell them what the language is like as show them what it is like. By exposing them to the language, we prompt them, encourage them, invite them to reach a proper understanding of the language, not from without, That's to say, not by interpreting it in terms of some other language that they already understand, but from within, the kind of thing that Williams captures in that quotation. However, this is not just a matter of us using the language while they watch. We do also describe the language. We make conceptual connections explicit. We distinguish between different forms of speech. We expose pieces of nonsense and such like. But the significant thing is that even when we do all of this, we do it in terms that are ultimately unintelligible except to those who understand. We have no choice. Our descriptions cannot be acknowledged except from the point of view of such understanding. So the exploration of language that Wittgenstein is envisaging is therefore a reflexive, self-conscious process. It's a moving to and fro in which we maintain a certain conceptual point of view, partly by producing representations that cannot be produced except from that point of view, with the constant aim of keeping the point of view itself in focus. But what is this point of view that I'm now referring to? Well, I've characterized it as the point of view that is implicit in an understanding of our language. But what is that? Well, this question in turn invites two others, is connected to two others. How exactly is language being understood here? And who, in this discussion, are we? And these two questions come together as follows. What, in this discussion, is our language? Not English, not German, not French. It's not any empirically identified language of that kind. The example about aunts being female that I used earlier might have looked like an example concerning English, simply because that is the language in which I have presented it. But if we were concerned specifically with English, then there would be no reason to think that the relevant linguistic practices cannot be described except to those who already understand the language. There's no impediment to describing the use of the words aunt and female in, for example, French. No, the example has nothing specifically to do with English. The relevant linguistic practices are such as our refusing to count somebody as an aunt unless we count that person as female. And we here include monolingual speakers of French, who themselves participate in this practice through their use of the expressions tante and le sexe féminin. So our language is something more like our range of conceptual resources. And certainly this makes it clearer why anyone should think that it's impossible to describe our language without using it. And it also absolves Wittgenstein of a kind of empirical idealism, a rather crazy and uninteresting kind of empirical idealism at that. Because, as I observed earlier, it is contingent that the English word aren't is used in the way that it is. Had Wittgenstein meant to ground the necessity in such contingencies as this, had he meant that the necessity of aunts being female was due to English speakers using the words aunt and female in a certain way, then he would in effect have been saying that the limits of reality are set in part by certain historical accidents involving the actual mechanics of linguistic representation. And one thing that belies that sort of idealism is that it would still have been necessary that aunts were female, and a fortiori aunts would still have been female, even if the words aunt and uncle had had their meanings interchanged. True, it would not then have been correct to utter the sentence, aunts are female, but that's another matter. In fact, aunts would have been female whatever we had got up to. That is part of what is meant by saying that aunts have to be female. There are forces in Wittgenstein, however, that make it very difficult to keep a grip on this. Wittgenstein does not ground necessity in simple contingencies of word use, but, as we've seen, he does ground it in contingencies. Our language might have been different. Does this not mean that we might have admitted the possibility of male aunts? And if so, does it not follow that there might have been male aunts? Or again, doesn't it follow from the fact that our arithmetical language might have been different, that twice 2 might not have been 4? Admittedly, Wittgenstein will insist that twice 2 is 4 of necessity. That twice 2 is 4, he will say, is a rule. And yet, it's a rule only because of our contingent linguistic practices, and not just in the sense that we might have used different sounds or different inscriptions to express it. Are there not Wittgensteinian reasons for saying that had those practices been different, twice 2 would not have been 4? A conclusion which, when it's not giving us a thoroughly unnerving sense of vertigo, seems to be just false. Another affirmation of a rather crazy empirical idealism. Well, Wittgenstein need not in fact say any such thing. I think these quandaries are real for him, but they're real in a way that is compatible with him having a clear solution to them. And I'll have more to say in a little while about what I mean by this. Wittgenstein can respond as follows. It's not that had our practices been different, twice 2 would not have been 4. Rather, had our practices been different, we would not have had such a rule. We would not have thought in those terms. But it remains the case that twice 2 is 4 of necessity. Nothing is to count as a proper calculation if it stands in violation of that. Again, our language might have been different, not in the sense that we might have admitted the possibility of male aunts, which is not something that we could have done. For our concept of an aunt and our concept of maleness would not have been those concepts if they had not excluded each other. No, our language might have been different rather in the sense that we might not have had those concepts. Similarly, the contingency of our linguistic practices is the simple contingency of them existing at all. And as we have seen, it's a deep contingency. We're lucky, for example, that people don't come to blows over whether elementary sums have been performed correctly, a point that Wittgenstein himself famously makes. But insofar as this means that there is a contingent grounding for what is necessary, it neither threatens the necessity nor indicates the setting of any limits of reality by some feature of our representations. And as regards the question of who we are, there's no reason to think that this question should not admit of perfectly definite answer once various matters have been resolved, though in fact there is also no pressing need to resolve them, since nothing in what has just been said hinges on their resolution. The matters in question include whether being one of us means sharing various outlooks or merely being able to share them. And if the latter, in what sense of able, and either way, which outlooks. However these matters are resolved, we are not just English speakers. On some ways of resolving them, we are a certain group of human beings. On other ways of resolving them, we are all human beings. On other ways of resolving them, we include any beings, actual or potential, with whom humans can communicate, or any beings whom humans can recognize as producing linguistic representations. So Wittgenstein can be exonerated. The problem is that it's extremely difficult to stop there. It's extremely difficult not to envisage the we expanding, as it were, to infinity. Once we have considered the various possibilities above, we find it hard ultimately not to think of ourselves as all possible producers of linguistic representations. And if we do think in those terms, then one of two things can happen. The first thing that can happen is that the contingency disappears altogether. Our language comes to admit of no alternative. Any evidence that something is a use of language at all is automatically evidence that it is a use of our language. The references to us and to our language are then in effect redundant. And philosophy must once again be seen as the exploration of some unchanging, superphysical landscape, a kind of Platonism. Now that possibility would clearly be unacceptable to Wittgenstein. The second thing that can happen is that the contingency is retained. Our language does admit of alternatives. But given the nature of its expansion, remember the image of we expanding to infinity, given the nature of that, these alternatives are not real, representable alternatives. We and our language are to be understood transcendently, not as an aspect of that to which our representations answer, but as a limit of that to which our representations answer. But what this is transcendental idealism. And this possibility, I take it, would be equally unacceptable to Wittgenstein because it's incoherent. It acknowledges alternatives to our language, which it nevertheless does not acknowledge as having any of the marks of alternatives to our language. It sees contingency where it acknowledges that there is only necessity. It casts as limits, in the sense of limitations, what it recognizes as limits in the sense of essential features. So somehow, if Wittgenstein's view is to be safeguarded, the urge to see the we expanding in this way must be resisted. But again, there are forces in Wittgenstein himself that make that urge almost irresistible. Indulging in the kind of self-conscious reflection that Wittgenstein advocates, we can't help asking, but what ultimately does somebody's being an aunt consist in? Or again, what does something's being green consist in? We can't help asking these questions because we can't help wondering about the essential nature of that to which our representations answer. That whose character gives our language its point and helps to make it possible. We know that aunts have to be female, and we know that females have to have a certain biological constitution. Those are our rules. But what does it take, ultimately, for things to be configured in such a way that somebody is an aunt, or in such a way that something is green? On a Wittgensteinian view, there's nothing that we can summon in response to such questions that is clearly separated from the language itself. Someone who wants to know what somebody's being an aunt consists in, or what something's being green consists in, can't just focus attention on somebody who is an aunt or on something that is green and think that's what it consists in, because it's not clear what they are referring to by that. Anyone who wants to know what something's being green consists in must observe us communicating with one another and exercising various discriminatory capacities that we possess. Not only that, such a person must understand our acts of communication and see the point of our classifications. They must see how we exercise the concept of an aunt or the concept of a green thing. See what role that concept plays in our lives. See how it helps us to make sense of things. Such a person must come to share or already share our form of life. They must come to be or already be one of us. So we can't answer the question except by acknowledging that what somebody's being an aunt consists in, or what something's being green consists in, is, at least in part, how we carry on. And the only way to prevent this from being a rather crazy empirical idealism is to let the we expand to infinity. Or in other words, assuming that the concept of being an aunt and the concept of being green cannot be regarded as part of some superphysical landscape, to let the idealism turn transcendental, as we've already noted. And again, as we've already noted, such transcendental idealism is incoherent. So how can Wittgenstein resist it? Well, I think he can resist it by simply disallowing the questions that led to it. We must not ask, what does somebody's being an aunt consist in? Or what does something's being green consist in? Or at least, we mustn't ask these questions with a certain metaphysical intent. The first question may be a perfectly good one when asked as a request for conceptual clarification, and it's then to be answered by saying that an aunt is a sister of a parent. The second question may be a perfectly good one when intended as a request for a scientific explanation, and it is then to be answered in terms of wavelengths and the rest. But the questions weren't being asked in these innocuous ways in the train of thought that we considered earlier. And somehow we have to see these questions when they're asked in the wrong way as pseudo-questions, symptoms of an illness that itself awaits Wittgensteinian therapy. The fact remains that it was assimilation of Wittgenstein's work that led us to pose the questions. It was assimilation of Wittgenstein's work that tempted us to affirm the transcendental idealism. Moreover, and this is an important point, without which this entire exegetical approach to Wittgenstein would be altogether harder to justify, there is evidence that Wittgenstein himself feels the force of the temptation. The question how far our mathematics depends on us, for instance, is one that he himself grapples with very uncomfortably. So consider this quotation, and this is on page 2 of the handout, a quotation from Philosophical Investigations. But mathematical truth is independent of whether human beings believe it or not. That's the interlocutor. Certainly, the propositions human beings believe that twice 2 is 4 and twice 2 is 4 do not mean the same. The latter is a mathematical proposition. The other, if it makes sense at all, may perhaps mean human beings have arrived at the mathematical proposition. The two propositions have entirely different uses. But what would this mean? Even though everybody believed that twice 2 was 5, it would still be 4. For what would it be like for everybody to believe that? Well, I could imagine, for instance, that people had a different calculus, or a technique which we should not call calculating. But would it be wrong? And then consider this quotation, the next quotation on the handout from Zettel. We have a colour system as we have a number system. Do the systems reside in our nature or in the nature of things? How are we to put it? Not in the nature of numbers or colours. Then is there something arbitrary about this system? Yes and no. It is akin both to what is arbitrary and to what is non-arbitrary. And then, the final quotation on the handout, Bernard Williams's reply to that quotation from Wittgenstein. The diffidence about how to put it comes from the problem how to put a supposed philosophical truth, which, if it is uttered, must be taken to mean an empirical falsehood, or worse. Wittgenstein's theory of meaning points in the direction of a transcendental idealism. We're driven to state it in forms which are required to be understood, if at all, in the wrong way. So I think there's a real problem here. Now, my own view is that a proper response to this problem has to draw on Wittgenstein's earlier work. And in particular, I think it has to draw on the distinction between saying and showing, which Wittgenstein had earlier thought gave him special license to endorse certain kinds of nonsense, including, in my view, transcendental idealism. But that, as they say, is an undertaking for another occasion. Thank you.